I'm going to read tonight from the letters of Mari Sandoz that I've edited. I'm going to read not her letters, but my introduction, so that it sort of prepares the readers of the letters by telling some of the things that aren't included in that collection. The letters themselves came largely from the University of Nebraska archives. The university has a very large collection of her letters, over 40 years of the letters. Somewhere between 25 and 30,000 letters are there. For the book, I've, of course, had to condense considerably, but I think I've selected among the most interesting of the letters and the ones that delineate her life and her career. The letters deal primarily, and the book is dealing primarily with Mari Sandoz's work as an author, her research and her writing, her traveling, her problems, and the problems that she solved with her editors, that sort of thing. They don't deal very much with her private life, and what I thought would be significant in her private life I've discussed in the introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight and to talk about, I think, about my favorite subject next to my grandchildren, Mari Sandoz. I have been researching her work since about 1969, but she's such a fascinating person as well as being such a splendid writer that I've never tired of hearing about her or reading about her or learning more about her. Tonight I'm going to read excerpts from my introduction to the letters of Mari Sandoz, hoping, of course, that you'll all rush out and check out the book or buy it and read what Mari herself has to say. All right. A fire in the Greenwich Village apartment in which Mari Sandoz lived drove the tenants from the building, all that is but Sandoz. Determined that January night in 1956 to protect her irreplaceable research material, she carried her huge collection of notes, file cards, manuscripts, and correspondence out to the fire escape, ignoring the flames and water pouring into her rooms from the fire hoses. She was too busy and concerned for her historical material to think of her own danger. In search for a new and safer home, she looked first for protection and ample room for her files, rather than for her personal comfort. To a friend, she listed the amenities of the new location at 422 Hudson: a virtually fireproof brick building, basement storage for her files, a safer, more private entrance, less chance that someone could in any way disturb her records. This was a typical attitude and reaction for Sandoz, since historical sources formed the basis of almost all her writing. Fortunately, she saved her letters also from the fire, for in those letters she reveals the story of her work and much of what is known of her life. When Edward Weeks, editor of Atlantic Monthly Press, wrote A.E. Sheldon in June 1935 in Quiet Confidence for authentic details about old Jules Sandoz, who was, I understand, a famous old character in the settlement days of Nebraska, he was being merely prudent. Weeks was about to present the press's 1935 nonfiction award to Mari Sandoz for her biography of her father, old Jules, and it behooved him to check with Dr. Sheldon, superintendent of the Nebraska State Historical Society, professor of history, state legislator, and newspaper editor. This trepidation concerning her Western truths, however, would mark much of Sandoz's later relationships with Eastern editors and publishers as well. I do not in the least wish to challenge her word, Weeks wrote Sheldon, but it is in a sense my responsibility to our readers to make sure that the character and description of old Jules is as secure and authentic as care can take it. Sheldon's response was immediate and positive. He had known Jules during the 12 years he, Sheldon, had lived in the Sandhills, and Jules was all she claimed him to be. Furthermore, Sheldon noted that Mari Sandoz herself was also an interesting character, an original genius in her own way, which is something different from that of her father, but nonetheless engaging. He noted that she had worked at various times for the Society and was at that time giving him some assistance in his own historical work. He had observed her research work and had read a considerable part of her manuscript, and he concluded, "From what I know of Jules Sandoz and Mari Sandoz, the story is a reliable and accurate picture of life in the northwestern Nebraska region." Weeks accepted Sheldon's recommendation. A few days later, he telegraphed to Sandoz that she had won the 1935 Atlantic Nonfiction Prize for $5,000. National recognition of her writing, so long in coming, finally would be hers. Her determination to portray the West, as she knew it, however, meant that this was only one obstacle she had to overcome on her way to acceptance as an author of significance. Eventually, she published 21 books, won numerous national prizes, and became a noted public speaker and a radio and television personality. Throughout her life, she battled the misconceptions and stereotypes of the West, held by those in the East. She was well qualified for that role. Born in 1896 on a primitive homestead near the Niobrara River to Swiss immigrant parents during the settlement of Nebraska's northwestern frontier, she was concerned with America's past, particularly with the history of the Great Plains during the Indian Wars. She lectured everyone, from editors at Encyclopedia Britannica to various Hollywood producers and directors, about accuracy. Her letters indicate that she was just as involved with 20th century problems. The perception that the West was still considered only a colony of the East, the farm crises of the 1920s and 30s, events leading up to World War II, including the growth of fascism both in Europe and in America, the post-war excesses, the government policies that drove the Indians from their reservations into urban ghettos, the defoliation of Vietnam. She was often involved in attempting to rectify some of the world's ills, both directly and through her writing. Her writing dominated her adult life. The letters selected here illustrate primarily those aspects of Mari Sandoz that relate to her writing, researching, and publishing. They are not intended to convey the entirety of this complex woman's life experiences. The Sandoz collection at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, in which the majority of the letters are to be found, is huge but incomplete. The earliest letter in the collection is dated 1926, when Sandoz was already a woman of 30 with an eventful youth behind her. Some of those early years are still largely unknown to the researcher. Some were deliberately obscured by Sandoz. Her memory for dates in her own history was always hazy, perhaps at times intentionally so, although she was conscientious about dates in her historical research. In a number of her biographical sketches, for instance, she gave her birth date variously as 1901 to 1903. She claimed that lack of a birth certificate made it impossible to verify her age, but the family Bible, as well as a Lutheran baptismal certificate, confirm her date as May 11, 1896. Other dates may have been missed more innocently. "We moved into the hills in 1911, she wrote in Inquirer. It was actually 1910, the autumn after her youngest sister Caroline was born." She was also less than forthcoming about her early 5-year marriage to Sandhill rancher Ray McCumber. "I'm single," she replied when asked her marital status, and indeed she was single. She was also divorced, but that fact never appeared in the thousands of letters she wrote. Although she used the name Marie McCumber for her writing until she settled on the name Mari Sandoz in 1929, she so thoroughly and successfully hid the marriage that only after her death did it become known even to many of her closest acquaintances. Sandoz's recollection of her early desire to be a writer is verified by memories of her brothers close to her in age and her schoolmates. Her first published story, written for the children's page of the Omaha Daily News, appeared when she was 11 and precipitated a violent scene with her father. Using various pen names, she's published 5 more stories. Though this hardly guaranteed that she would become an adult author, she recalled that seeing her name in print convinced her of her future career. She suppressed her writing, at least for publication, during her adolescence, her teaching in country schools, and her marriage. But after her divorce in 1919 and her flight from the Sandhills to Lincoln, she vigorously sought publication. By 1922, she had become a permanent resident of Lincoln and began to send her short stories to editors of magazines, always to have them returned to her. Shortly after that, Mari began to save her correspondence. Until the publication of Old Jewels in 1935, Sandoz suffered periods of stress, frustration, and severe poverty. She later recalled these apprentice years in Lincoln positively. In I Remember Lincoln, published in the Lincoln Journal in 1959, she referred to the young intellectuals with whom she'd shared hours of talk over 5-cent cups of coffee at a local meeting place or at her tiny apartment. But the article was written long after she had achieved renown. There were other experiences: resentment at what she saw as snubs by important people, illness caused by malnutrition, despair at lack of publishing success, and her extremely negative view of Lincoln itself. That view is inscribed in her 1939 capital city, no matter how she denied it. Sandoz's publishing problems were exacerbated by the region she first wrote about, that small area of the High Plains, the Nebraska Sandhills. Most Eastern editors had never heard of it. Some apparently did not believe it existed. Those who did were not sure it was worth writing about. Yet Mari was determined that the Sandhills, the settling of that region, and the battles over its use, ethical, ecological, social, and economic problems, were of importance, locally, of course, but at a much more general level. The frontier as she knew it, the development and settlement of former Indian lands, was as important as the settlement of Jamestown and Plymouth, as she pointed out in one of her letters. But how to attract the Eastern publishers to this idea, especially when the Sandhills, along with the entire Midwest, was in a drought cycle that seemed to doom it to insignificance agriculturally and economically? Her letters limn her efforts, her methods, and her unshakable faith in her message. They also revealed her determination to tell her message in her own way, in her voice, the authentic voice of her region, sometimes raspy, scratchy, raucous, sometimes softly lyrical, but always unmistakably Western and Sandoz. Excuse me. Although she worked independently of others, she did all her own research, writing, and revising. She had one goal in common with other serious Western writers. She was committed to telling an alternative version of history. The white adventurers who came into the Great Plains were not, in her view, always heroic. Rather, to the Indians who first occupied the territory, they were interlopers. The whites could be treacherous, liars and thieves, destructive of the land and its inhabitants. In Old Jewels, her history of the settlement period, the whites were the protagonists, but the settlers displayed all the frailties of mankind. They could be weak as well as brave. Some were flawed, unpredictable, niggardly, murderous, and often unattractive, though seldom dull. Old Jewels himself was villainous at times. And in her fine histories of the Plains Indian Wars of the 1870s, Sandoz depicted the scene from the Indians' perspective. In her judgment, the U.S. Army and government were seldom admirable. Contrary to conventional treatment of the time, she often debunked them as aggressors. Although this view is more common today, Sandoz was one of the few to advance it then and to treat Indians as important individuals. She carried her ideas even further in 3 books in her Great Plains series, The Buffalo Hunters, The Cattlemen, and The Beaver Men. She focused on the animals and the ecology they affected. Particularly in The Beaver Men, she recognized the little-known real heroes of human history as well, those who were far from sources of government power, but who actually lived and explored in the West. Such ideas led to occasional criticism by readers, reviewers, and historians. In her letters, Sandoz revealed her relish for a good conflict. After The Cattlemen was published, she noted to a friend that she was receiving a goodly number of hostile letters from families of characters she had portrayed in the book. A good fight brewing, she said. Although she could not tolerate close interpersonal conflicts, battle on a larger landscape suited her just fine. During her early Lincoln years, it was the entrenched oligarchy, as she saw it, along with the complacent republicanism of the 1920s and 30s, that her liberal spirit deplored. Once Old Jewels was accepted for publication in 1935, her battles moved to the east. Her skirmishes from then on were primarily with the Eastern establishment, not just with publishers, editors, and critics, personal battles for the integrity of her writing and for sales of her books, but also on a broader level with bureaucrats and financiers. The letters tell also of battles with Hollywood, most of which Sandoz lost. Miss Marissa was originally conceived and written for Greer Garson, then at Warner Brothers. But Garson moved to a different studio before the script could be completed, and a short time later she was the star of a film titled Strange Lady in Town. The similarities between this film and Sandoz's proposal are considerable, although the setting moved from Nebraska to New Mexico. A film titled Chief Crazy Horse drew heavily from Sandoz's book Crazy Horse, but she was given neither credit nor money. When Universal Studios' Gregory Ratoff insisted that material in the film was in the public domain, though unquestionably it could come only from her book, she was angry enough to challenge Jacques Chambrun, then her agent, about it. Because the film violated a number of Sioux tribal taboos and was historically inaccurate, Sandoz would have nothing to do with it, although friends urged her to sue the studio for plagiarism. When the film came out, she contented herself with writing the fiery letter and repudiating any connection with the movie. Later, Warner Brothers bought the rights to Cheyenne Autumn. They used its title and little more. The film was finally a travesty of her book and of history. Seldom did she speak with such vehemence as in her letters to James Webb, the scriptwriter. In spite of these experiences, and in spite of illness, in January 1965, she was discussing the possibility that Blanche Yerka would play the role of the villainous Gullah in the filming of Slocum House. She had great self-confidence in herself years before anybody else did, that is, anybody on the national scene. When Mari came to Lincoln and entered the University of Nebraska as an adult special, she had had almost no English in grade school and had no high school at all. But her instructors recognized very early that this was a woman who certainly had talent. And she had a lot of local support. But people in the East weren't the least bit interested in what she had to write. And it took her 12 or 13 years before she reached national importance. But in 1926, that's the first letter I've ever seen. The oldest letter I've ever seen was a 1926 letter. And I begin the letters in this book with a 1928 letter. But any letters that existed before 1926 have disappeared. And at that time, she was 30 with a very interesting youth behind her. Still, for someone to realize or to assume before anybody else did nationally that her work and her research and her studies and her troubles would be of significance, I think is quite a remarkable achievement. Sandoz's letters are remarkable for their extent. They cover 40 years, from 1926 to Sandoz's death in 1966, and a number between 25 and 30,000. Sure of the importance of her work long before anybody else was, Sandoz methodically began keeping carbons, even of her holograph notes, for some years before she was published nationally. In addition to correspondence on her own writing, many letters relate to her concerns as a mentor to aspiring writers. She contributed her time and interest with almost inconceivable generosity, writing long and frequent letters to them. Fully 1/4 to 1/3 of her correspondence is with or about these fledgling writers, many of whom she helped to publication. To include more than a fraction of so extensive a collection is impractical. Therefore, one winnows. Only a few examples of Sandoz's correspondence as a teacher of and guide to other writers are published in this volume. On the other hand, some aspects of Sandoz's life are barely recorded in her letters. At times, she led a busy social and cultural life. She was always interested in the theater, in music and art, but there are only fleeting references to these interests. Her letters include references to an occasional play or art show, sometimes a thank you for a lovely weekend at someone's country home, enough to indicate that she could break her strenuous writing schedule to lunch with critics, writers, and journalists. She wrote of trips to Washington, D.C. for hearings related to Indians of the Plains and sent notes to various members of the New York Posse of the Westerners, a group dedicated to preserving the history of the West and of which she was a charter member. She was not living the life of an anchorite all the time. Contrary to what one might expect from a prolific reader and writer, Mari seldom wrote in detail about either theories or specifics of the books she read at the rate of 6 or 7 a week. She talked about them, but she seldom wrote about them, nor did she often share many details of the emotional or psychological aspects of her own writing. Sandoz's letters reveal little of her inner life or close emotional relationships. She once wrote of her father, "Jules was no Hamlet. He never questioned himself." This could be applied to Mari as well. She read Nietzsche, Freud, and Jung and considered their theories. She clearly accepted Freud's explanation of the Oedipus complex, Jung's collective unconsciousness, and Nietzsche's will to power. But if her introspection included consideration of her own subconscious or libido, she did not write about it. If there was soul-searching, she kept it out of her letters. Even her earliest extant letters suggest a personality fully formed and usually at ease with itself. 2, possibly 3 letters referred to marriage proposals. Not one word mentioned her marriage and divorce. Although the letters, particularly those between Sandoz and her longtime Lincoln friends, give glimpses of her personality not otherwise revealed, even here Sandoz displays considerable reserve. Their letters to her were often gossipy, breezy, funny, and clever. Her answers tended to be straightforward, interested, but direct. As one friend of many years wrote her, "I shall never be the detached person you are. Heaven knows I'd like to be." Sandoz changed in the 40 years covered in her correspondence. Still, her letters reveal a remarkably stable personality, a woman dedicated to her writing. She never deviated from her major purpose, to bring knowledge of Western history to the attention of American readers and to draw attention to the evils, past and present, of our civilization so that they could be corrected. Her letters emphasize that she judged people by their integrity in following their own goals. She had no use for those who wasted their time in a futile or frivolous life. Her friends, both men and women, were those who strove to accomplish something, whatever it might be. Sandoz's friends remembered her as a gifted conversationalist, a raconteur, and an authority on almost any subject mentioned. From American history to biology, from folk medicine to big and little league baseball. If she had never written a book, she would be remembered by many as a talented storyteller. Fortunately, we have the letters to augment the recollections of those who knew her as full of verve, energy, curiosity, and esoteric knowledge. Except in times of illness, and sometimes then as well, she drove herself hard and expected others to follow the same regime. Her letters also provide valuable evidence of this writer's patterns of work. Sandoz attributed her work patterns to her Swiss ancestry, particularly to the work ethic of her mother's German-Swiss antecedents. There was also the Calvinist background of her father's family. Considering her own difficult childhood and youth, she may well have equated her personal worth with her ability to work. Certainly, when she went to Lincoln after her divorce in 1919, she knew that whatever became of her and her goals would be dependent entirely on her own ability to achieve them. From her description of her method of writing, it's clear that writing was never easy for Mari. As her sisters attest, she worked harder than anyone else they knew. Her ideas, however, came easily. She seems never to have had a dry spell. Usually, she worked on more than one book at a time. She had 3 books clearly in mind or contracted for at the time of her death. A book on oil on the Great Plains, one on the Dog Soldier Societies of the Plains Indians for Hastings House, and a book on the Sioux for Harper's. The research, too, though challenging and sometimes frustrating, was interesting and rewarding. She enumerated her typical range of research in her letters. Almost every archival repository on the Great Plains, the New York Public Library and other Eastern repositories, government records, historical societies, and of even more importance, her personal contacts. Some of the latter gave privileged information. Some notes she referred to, particularly Indian notes, are not now in her files. She may have destroyed them before her death, as she sometimes hints. The value and extent of Sandoz's sources have not yet been thoroughly explored. In her correspondence, Sandoz revealed not only her belief that place was an essential element in writing, but also her methods of achieving geographical authenticity. She needed more than authenticity, however. She wanted to capture the aura, as she described it eloquently in her letter to the New York Times. Place shapes history and memory, as Sandoz knew well. She almost always began her books with a description of the setting. In Old Jules, Crazy Horse, Cheyenne Autumn, Love Song to the Plains, and many others, she described the places she knew, remembered, and returned to again and again: the West, the Great Plains, the sandhills of Nebraska. These places shaped her life and molded her as a writer. She saw her region as a microcosm of world history, containing within its boundaries prototypes of universal happenings, geological, historical, and natural. Sandoz created her adult life. The metamorphosis from the apprentice to the nationally recognized expert on the West is unfolded in her letters. By themselves, however, because they deal largely with her career, they may give the impression that she was consistently direct, forthright, and to the point. Less often do they reveal her considerable charm, her sense of fun, her hearty laugh, or her gregariousness, which she usually held in check, but which was nevertheless strong. A friend from her university years describes her as high-spirited, friendly, and sociable. A few letters, such as that to Edward Weeks in 1935, detailed her sociability, which she enjoyed all her life. Her wry humor surfaced only occasionally, as in her answer to the woman who wanted to review her book without reading it, or in her comment that Old Jules would live long after she was dead if it had been published by then. The letters illustrate the changes in her self-image as well as her status, reflected in her relationship with a publishing establishment. Before Old Jules, her letters were sometimes coy, certainly arch, as she attempted to make some impression. She complimented Forum on Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, wrote an exceedingly lengthy letter to the editors of Harper's in response to an essay on the importance of sex in biography, and sent H.L. Mencken an impassioned proposal for an opera based on the life of Crazy Horse, the Oglala Sioux chief killed in 1877 at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. What must those men have thought of this brash young woman whose short stories they always rejected as not quite suitable for our magazine? The correspondent amply illustrates that Sandoz went to considerable lengths to draw attention to herself as a person and a writer. But she did not, even in her most desperate moments, compromise her ideas. When Margaret Christie, her first agent, criticized her short story Victory, saying it was bad for her as a writer and would hurt her reputation, Sandoz refused to change it. In spite of the fact that she experimented endlessly with the form of Old Jules, she refused to fabricate details to strengthen scenes or characterization. Responding to changes suggested by Frank C. Hannigan of Dodd Mead, she was polite but firm. Caxton Press in Idaho was seriously interested in the manuscript, but their reader also wanted fictionalization, and Mari would not agree. Most of the 13 publishing companies who saw the manuscript were not interested at all. During this time, Sandoz became so discouraged that she vowed to give up writing altogether, a vow that lasted only a short time. But she did not back down on what she had to say or how she wanted to say it. Her early responses to critical suggestions indicate that she was willing to be more flexible about her short stories, but eventually she refused to do more with them either. She claimed to be bewildered by the conflicting advice given by different readers. There seemed to be no way she could please the editors. Easterners could not conceive of the sandhills and the frontier as a real place, and almost everything she wrote was set there. She finally burned most of her 75 or so stories that had circulated for several years. Very melodramatic solution, but memorable to those who watched or heard it. Sandoz tended toward the dramatic, and in common with many writers, was something of an actor in her own scenes. Her early letters in particular reflect this sense of drama. To Eleanor Hinman, her most devoted friend, she moaned, "I did feel as helplessly driven as Hardy's Tess. Now I must stagger on, I presume, with some semblance of notice to the Kantian duty whip that hangs over me for the rest of my life." This is in marked contrast to her concurrent accounts, written to publishers, in which she pictured herself as the local chaplain, her little apartment or favorite booth in a local coffee shop called Agony Corner because so many poured out their troubles to her. But time seems to have softened her memories. Later recollections of her childhood and her apprentice years were usually filled with detachment and humor. Detachment and humor were her saving grace during most of her career, but on occasion they vanished. When she became angry or concerned about an issue, she dealt with it head-on, as in her arguments with Atlantic Press and our publisher, Little Brown, about Slocum House. In her letter to Alfred McIntyre, she blamed the East for the flaws in Westerners' characters and threatened to take her book from Little Brown to another publisher. There were innumerable opportunities for Sandoz to take umbrage, to brood and to cherish wounds, but that seems not to have been her nature. Most of her life, she seemed to operate on the premise of sufficient unto the day. Although her letters, particularly those to Eleanor Hinman, showed her despair at times during her early Lincoln years, after all, 13 or 14 years of steady effort that seems never to succeed is cause for depression, periods of economic distress, she was usually resilient and resolute, of good cheer. She had inherited her father's paranoia to some extent, however, as well as her mother's sense of drama and imminent disaster. Although this translated into what some called overreaction, sometimes to personal crises, but more often to national and international events, there is evidence that she had some basis for her concern. Her sense of imminent doom was most dramatically expressed when she spoke of her fears for the United States. Her first mention of Hitler and his Mein Kampf appeared in the 1930s. Her fear of Hitler's fascism, stronger than her fear of either Stalin or Mussolini, permeated her letters during the later 1930s and during the war years. In 1940, she bet a friend that the Germans would be in North America by July 4. Although she was happy to pay off the dollar debt, she still feared that Hitler would be able to form a puppet government in North America, quote, perhaps with the Duke of Windsor and his American wife, unquote, to rule, after England had capitulated to Germany. Perhaps because of her Swiss ancestry, she was much more concerned about the European theater than the Pacific War. Both Capital City, 1939, and the Tom Walker, 1947, are centered on 20th century problems leading to and resulting from World War II. Sandoz's letters reveal her very human imperfections. She could be sharp, on occasion patronizing. In her early years, she was sometimes cloying. She was opinionated, and as she became older, surer, and perhaps more verbose, she found it difficult to accept contradiction. Early in her career, she sought criticism, but after she had authored a number of highly respected books, she took criticism badly, whether from an editor, reviewer, or friend. She changed agents when Harold Ober was unenthusiastic about the Tom Walker, for instance, and later broke with her friend Thomas Hornsby Farrell because of his criticism of Son of the Gambling Man. This absolute assurance of her in her own view, so significant for the integrity of her early work, may have hurt the quality of some later work. By then, she had so much self-confidence and presence that she simply overrode the opposition. On the other hand, the letters also give glimpses of Sandoz's talent for friendship. Although she was a self-contained woman in many ways, and few could claim any real intimacy with her, She had a strong bent for congeniality and maintained some of these relationships from early years until her death. The letters to her sisters are certainly, I suppose, more relaxed and a little friendlier than letters to her friends or to people that she worked with. But Sandoz does not seem ever to have written out her heart to anybody. She can be, particularly to her sister Flora, I think, franker and perhaps a softer woman than she is in her other letters, because she had raised Flora, actually. Flora was 10 years younger than Mari. Mari named her. Mari's mother was so busy with the other children and with outside chores that Mari actually raised Flora. And so she, certainly was on an intimate basis with her. But even in her letters to Flora and to her other sister Caroline, she never really lets go in the way many of us would do and talk about her emotions, that sort of thing. Her strongest longtime friendship, formed in 1925 in Lincoln, was with Melvin Van Den Bark, the man she always credited with teaching her how to write. Coming to the University of Nebraska from the University of Iowa in 1925, he taught short story writing, and it was in this class that Sandoz learned, after years of unsuccessful writing, how to organize her material. Van was a bachelor, with responsibility for an ailing mother and various nieces and nephews. These were Depression years, and of course, Social Security was non-existent. Mari, desperately poor but with ambition, optimism, and drive, spent a great deal of time with him while in Lincoln, and their close friendship continued until her death. Mari was something of an oddity in Lincoln, and Lincolnites were always interested in university professors, so their relationship was gossiped about. People often assumed that they were going together. Some believed they were engaged. Others suspected an illicit affair. Sandoz later laughed about it all. There was apparently nothing sexual, but a deep and abiding friendship. One of the emotions she expressed, not surprisingly, was gratitude for his early guidance in her writing, and she dedicated her love song to the plains to him, the highest honor she could bestow. Sandoz did not, as a rule, approve of dedicating books to individuals. Although she learned from Van how to organize her material, the writing itself never became easy. Letters written even late in her life emphasized that it was a tedious, laborious process, but her style was every bit as important to her as the subject matter. Although her desire to write short stories first lured her into research and the field of history, she struggled with problems of style throughout her life. A determined plodder, as she more than once described herself, she worked from file cards through revision after revision, often 10 or more reams of paper for a book, as amply demonstrated in the manuscripts in the Sandoz collection. Her belief that writing could be taught, that anyone could learn to write, came from her own experience, and she preached this tenet constantly. Her letters explain in detail the method she worked out for herself through years of experimenting and striving. The first step was the most important. Before beginning any writing, she would type a simple declaratory sentence stating her theme. This would go on the wall in front of her typewriter. 2 or 3 of these statements can still be found in her files. She actively promoted and marketed her books. The East, she learned, quickly forgot the reviews. Her market was in the West. Yesterday, I had 2 requests for my new books, and I couldn't give the name of even one bookstore in all of Manhattan that carries my most recent work, she complained to an editor. Every year or so, she would go on a round of autographing sessions at Midwestern bookstores. At the same time, she would sandwich in lectures, often free of charge at public libraries. If she could manage it, she would swing into western Nebraska to visit her family in the Sandhills. She continued her concern for her writing even during the last pain-filled years before her death. Old Jules Country, published in 1965, was conceived by Walter Fries, her editor, and Mary Abbott, her agent. But Sandoz listed the possible selections, and later she was discussing her small recollection, The Christmas of the Phonograph Records, with Bruce Nickel of the University of Nebraska Press. Perhaps more than anything else, the letters revealed that for Sandoz, being a serious Western writer meant doing battle. She was fond of remarking that whereas some people were promiscuous about marital partners, she was promiscuous about publishers. Eventually, she had 9. At the end of her life, she was still under contract to 5. Her most volatile relationship was with Atlantic Monthly Press and its publisher, Little Brown. Her letters show her at first thrilled and grateful to have won the 1935 Nonfiction Award, and also show how quickly she became disenchanted with the press. There's a curious mixture of almost simultaneous positive and negative attitudes. Shortly after receiving the award, she wrote to Edward Weeks, the editor, "I can't thank you enough for understanding art westernisms." But shortly thereafter, she was telling people that her 10 days in Boston, while the editor and she went over the manuscript word by word, had been among the most harrowing experiences in her life. The continuing questions and emendations in the next few months reinforced the feeling that her world and that of Boston was almost incompatible. The next few years, during which she was lionized in the East as a new and exotic author, were exhilarating. She was probably as euphoric at that time as she ever was. Never again would she write with the enthusiasm and frank pleasure about the literati of the metropolitan East as she did in the letters telling of her introductions to critics, writers, and publishers during her first 2 visits east in 1935. At the same time, and perhaps symptomatic of her reservations about and hostility to the establishment, she suffered more severely from her migraines than ever before or after. The pain was so excruciating while she was in New York in November that she caught an early flight back to Lincoln, canceling meetings with friends old and new. Although migraine is too complex a medical condition to attribute entirely to one cause, stress had much to do with the headaches that she had suffered since infancy. So severe were her attacks that she would be incapacitated for 2 to 3 days a week. Eventually, she found a medical remedy to control the migraines, but that would not occur until some time after Old Jewels was published, and she had had some continued success with her writing. The letters between Sandoz and her later editors and publishers show a more experienced and tougher writer. With the exception of her troubles with Clarkson Potter, who published Son of the Gambling Man in 1960, in her mind the most disastrous of any of her publishing relationships, she had considerably more influence on the fate of her books. Hastings House, specializing in Americana, was from the beginning more sympathetic to her point of view than earlier publishers had been. But Hastings, too, sometimes failed to produce as well or as promptly as she expected, and she pulled no punches when she felt disappointed. She also introduced a weapon that she used more than once: the threat to quit writing and take on another kind of work. It might be teaching, lecturing, or serving as a regular member of a TV quiz show. At any rate, in every case, she was coaxed back to writing, and she usually won the concession she sought. Eventually, Sandoz was invited to write for Lippincott, Harper's, and others, and worked with their editors amicably. But it seemed that with each book, she was confronted with a different and frustrating problem, not always due to the fact that she was a Westerner working with Easterners, but often enough to make it obvious that there were different points of view or standards. Once it was a cartographer whose map got into the buffalo hunters without her supervision. He located Bismarck, misspelled, in Minnesota. More than once, it was an officious copy editor who in one instance substituted an incorrect date, and on other occasions changed spellings and thus meanings. Often there was trouble with Sandoz's use of language. She knew she was an expert in this field and took umbrage when there was tampering. Even the artwork and photographs were at times inaccurate. Sandoz's correspondence shows quite a different relationship with the University of Nebraska Press. She was always concerned for its success, but it was against her better judgment that she agreed in 1957 to let the press publish a collection of her short work to help its faltering finances. She could not imagine that there would be interest in her early work. She wrote to Virginia Faulkner, "I am also struck with the inadequacy of my short writings as any gauge to me as a writer, or at least I hope so." That Hostiles and Friendlies, published in 1959, was so successful was because of Faulkner's skillful editing, according to Sandoz. Later, when her friend Bruce Nichol was director of the press, she became an unofficial advisor, and her letters regularly and enthusiastically proposed books for the Bison Books imprint of paperbacks. One of her first suggestions was John G. Neihart's Black Elk Speaks, at that time out of print and remaindered. Until her death, she kept close ties with the University of Nebraska Press, but even here she occasionally had to correct interpretations of her language. The reader of Sandoz's letters in the University of Nebraska collection must keep in mind that the author herself intended that they be read and used for study. They are, of course, an extension of her personality, but of only a carefully guarded, usually controlled part of that personality. Nevertheless, they are a valuable resource for exploring Sandoz's professional life and the world in which she lived. Through her own retrospective letters, she furnished glimpses of her youth, growing up in a family and a culture antagonistic to her literary aspirations. Of even more value, perhaps, are her letters written about contemporaneous circumstances, from personal situations to world events. The letters delineate Sandoz's eventual success in her chosen field as a well-established literary and historical authority, but they also are a valuable record of the many obstacles she faced. Although she eventually came to terms with most of the Eastern publishing world, she could comment to Bruce Nichol as late as 1963 that she would like to write about the destructive influence of publishers on the writing of the 1940s through the 1960s, quote, and on the paucity of criticism in America except the monastic type from the colleges, written for other monastics and their employers, unquote. In addition to elucidating the history of Sandoz's career as a Western writer and historian, her correspondence also points up problems in the broader field of Western writing, for her experiences, her struggles and successes reflect those of others in this genre. Mary Austin fulminated against the East. Bartis Fisher was often without a publisher for his books and railed at what he called the immature Eastern establishment for its ignorance of and patronizing attitude toward the West. Walter Van Tilburg Clark reputedly was devastated by critics. Alan Swallow eventually started his own Western press in order to publish outstanding Western writers. Other Western writers did as Willa Cather and Mari Sandoz did, moving to the East in order to write about the West. Sandoz's letters thus give us the portrait of an individual's literary life, and they illuminate the broader perspective of Western writing as well. Thank you. The book that attracted me to Mari Sandoz was Crazy Horse. I liked Old Jewels, which is probably the book that she's most well known for, but Crazy Horse is the story of an Oglala Sioux war chief, a great hero to his people to this day. And that book to me was so superbly written that I wanted to know more about the author herself. And when it came time for me to write my dissertation, under Bernice Sloat, I visited with her and others in the English department and asked them if they thought that Mari Sandoz had enough national stature to be worthy of a dissertation. I really didn't know much about her at that point. And they were enthusiastic for several reasons, and one was that her great collection of her correspondence and her research material, her file cards, her manuscripts had just come into the university very recently. And I had the marvelous good luck of being able to be one of the very first people to work with that huge collection. They were delighted that someone wanted to do it, and I was delighted to get the chance to do it. So my dissertation started with research on Crazy Horse. Then I had to back up because, of course, the first of her great biographies was of her father, Old Jewels, and of course I wanted to research on that one also. So my dissertation dealt with the three great biographies, Old Jewels, Crazy Horse, and Cheyenne Autumn. Well, I lived on the farm. My husband and I farmed for a number of years, but I don't think that's what drew me to Mari as much as her personality and her. She was such a remarkable woman as well as being such a remarkable author. And she led me into great interest in Nebraska history and the Plains Indians, and I had to admire her because she was someone who did everything on her own and succeeded so well. She's just a remarkable woman. Well, certainly we shared a love of the outdoors and of solitude and of, the rural life. But her sandhills is considerably different than the Flat Valley where we farmed. Nebraska is so rich with writers, past writers, and I think present writers. We have, for a state of the size and age and population we just have a remarkable number of fine writers. And of course I think immediately of John Neihart, who was Mari's friend, by the way, and wrote about similar things. And Willa Cather, of course, is world-renowned. And Wright Morris and Lauren Isley and Tilly Olson and Don Welch and William Clefcorn and Ted Huser, and it goes on and on and on. And what it is about Nebraska that stimulates the writers, I'm not sure, but there's something there. I'm not a creative writer, and how people create writing just fascinates me, and I haven't a clue. The difference between the kind of writing I do and the kind of writing that creative writers do, I think will be pretty obvious tonight when I read my material, which is giving you information, but it's not necessarily deathless prose. And people who do creative writing can't explain it. It's one of those wonderful, inexplicable things about the human soul. But I so admire people who can do that, and I just don't have it. Well, I think anyone who's taught English probably hopes that he or she can be a mentor to others who are creative writers. Certainly I've helped a number of my students into publication or into graduate work, that sort of thing. But here again, I'm just a helper along the way. I don't do the creating myself. There's so many good ones, it's really hard to make a decision. There's one in here, though, that I cherish. It's one not from the University of Nebraska. It is one that Mari's sister Flora gave me permission to use. It's the only one I used of their collection. It's very short. June 15th. Mari received her telegram from Atlantic Monthly Press. I think it was the 8th of June, somewhere around in there. June 15th, 1935. Dear Mother, wouldn't old Jules snort if he knew that his story won the $5,000 Atlantic Monthly Prize? Love. More details later. Yes, $5,000. Her letters are often long, amazingly long. How she did this and kept writing at the same time is almost impossible to know. But as I mentioned, she did know that these letters would be used for study, and so she sometimes says, quite frankly, well, I'm telling you all this because I want it in my files anyway. So, on the other hand, sometimes she forgets, I think, that other people are going to read the letters, and of course, those are the good ones. Yes?
Are most of the letters in the University of Nebraska Sandoz collection? Where are they written?
Yes, they're in Love Library, in the archives, and just unbelievable number of letters are up there. And of course, I'm not sure how many I put in the book, but it's just somebody else, 2 or 3 others could find a whole different collection that they'd like to use from the letters that I didn't use. While as I pointed out, in many of her letters, she's very businesslike, very direct. In fact, when I first began my research on Sandoz, I went first to the letters. And I was a little put off. She seemed to me like she had such a chip on her shoulder, and she was so abrupt and so sure of herself. It was later when I began to interview her friends and people who knew her that I began to get a more rounded personality, I think. So the letters are limited in that degree. They do deal with just really the business part of her life. But it was an interesting business. So I find the letters very interesting. Paul?
Are those letters in good shape? She was using carbon copies and so forth. Is there a project that should be done?
Oh, yes, there is. Yes.
Readable shape.
The library has applied once for a grant, and it was turned down several years ago, and they've been working on another one, and I don't know where that is.
It has been submitted.
I'm sorry?
It has been submitted.
It's submitted, but you haven't heard yet. Yes, they really need attention, especially the early ones, but her carbons, all of her carbons are, are on not even Xerox paper. It's like newsprint paper, and it shatters, and many of us have handled those now. And, of course, that doesn't do them any good. They're getting very fragile. I really hope that grant goes through. Because she revised so extensively, she apparently just threw away all of her early versions of Old Jewels. But there were 13, I counted them myself, there were 13 rejections. And she revised that book every time. Now, sometimes I'm sure it was much more extensive than others. But she revised that 13 times over probably 5 years. And there's no doubt in my mind from what I've heard from those who remember some of the early versions, that the later version was much, much improved. Mari had to work through a great deal of personal animosity, anger, frustration, not only with her father, but for a lot of the neighbors, for a lot of the things that went on in the Sandhills that she really hadn't liked. And what she ended up with is so remarkable because you do have the distance. You do have that detachment that's necessary. No, I'm sure that she needed to revise. And I've read some of her early stories that were in Prairie Schooner. Her first 3 stories, I think, were published in the Prairie Schooner. And you know that the heroine, or the protagonist, in some cases the heroine, in those little short stories are Mari herself, and she's feeling sorry for herself. So she had to work through, I think, a great deal of psychological stuff before she became such a good writer. What else? I've told you just about everything I know. Thank you very much.